Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Gary Gann and I'm a procurement counselor at Tribal Government Institute Apex Accelerator. Today we have a special guest, Mr. Adam Austin, who is the cybersecurity lead at Totem Technologies. Mr. Austin will be discussing the CMMC compliance roadmap, which is part one of a two-part series. Part two will take place on November 15th, 2023, and will cover CMMC compliance from a cost and duration perspective. We will answer any questions that you may have at the end of the discussion, so please enter any questions that you have in the questions box. Well, Mr. Austin, I'll hand it over to you so you can let us know more about yourself and Totem Technologies, and then we can get started with today's topic.
Okay, thanks. Can you still hear me okay, Gary?
I sure can.
Okay, let me share my screen. So, yep, I need permission, and we will show screen 2. So you should be seeing my screen, Gary. Could you confirm that?
Yep, we are good to go.
All right. Well, thank you, Gary, for the introduction, and I'm very pleased to be with the TGI Apex Accelerator and clients and associates today. Yeah, I'm Adam Austin. I'm the co-owner and cybersecurity lead at Totem Technologies. We are a small business, a micro business, that our mission is dedicated to helping our small business government contractor peers through cybersecurity compliance mandates. We have a little bit of experience. Actually, we have quite an extensive bit of experience and expertise in this arena, considering Totem Technologies is a spinoff, a daughter company of another company called Haight Bay and Associates. Both companies are based in Utah, in Ogden, Utah. I'm coming to you from my home office in South Central Pennsylvania, in Amish country, Pennsylvania. But Haight Bay and Associates is a prime U.S. Air Force contractor and a previous Apex Accelerator client. The Apex Accelerator used to be called PTAC, the Utah PTAC we were a client of. They helped us understand what it was going to take as a brand new small business to compete on a small business set aside for the U.S. Air Force. We were fortunate enough to write the winning proposal for that small business set aside. It's a logistics contract for the U.S. Air Force. We won that. We were awarded that contract in 2015, 5-year IDIQ. We, in 2021, were awarded the follow-on contract. So we've been very fortunate to provide what we would consider, I think the government would as well, a valuable service to the U.S. Air Force, and in the process save the Air Force millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars. We're able to execute much more efficiently as a small business. So we're quite proud of that. 8 years now and running, working on a logistics contract. So we perform maintenance, repair, overhaul, and shipping of a U.S. Air Force weather sensing system, a tactical weather sensing system. So it's it's mobile. You can move it anywhere around the world. There are several hundred of those systems placed around the world, statically on bases, but also they move to operating theaters, these tactical Air Force weather systems. So as part of executing that contract, we, Haight Bay and Associates, and to some extent Totem Technologies, comes into contact with various types of information that the government has mandated are worthy of some cybersecurity protections. And when we are operating in the Department of Defense space, as we are as a government contractor, we're also going to be subject to the Department of Defense holding us accountable for protecting that information, for implementing the requirements to protect that information. So we're going to discuss that accountability method. It's called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC. We're going to discuss that accountability method today and present you all with a roadmap to how to comply, to get your organization into compliance and eventually pass a CMMC assessment. I'm going to stress up front that the CMMC is not a real thing yet. The Department of Defense is in the process of what's called rulemaking, and we'll touch on that today. as well as building up a quote unquote ecosystem to support the tens of thousands of assessments that are going to have to happen every year under the CMMC regime. So we're going to be talking about that today. We welcome questions. You can type them in the chat, and then I'll stick around really as long as you all have questions at the end to answer any questions that you might have. Cybersecurity is alphabet soup. It's an acronym-rich environment. I will do my best to expand the acronyms that we encounter today. We've talked about CMMC, that's on this title slide here. There's also acronym here, DIB. That's the Defense Industrial Base. That is the supply chain for the Department of Defense. So all of the prime contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, vendors that help the DoD performance mission, that are part of the supply chain, that provide goods and services to the Department of Defense. We are members of the Defense Industrial Base. The entirety of the Defense Industrial Base has some sort of cybersecurity mandates. You may not be aware of that, but all of us, some 220,000, maybe even more companies execute in the Defense Industrial Base and have some sort of protections that we need to put in place. And we'll be held accountable for implementing those protections to a certain extent. All right, this is our contact information. I'm going to be showing you a website in a little bit as well, and copying the link to that website and some of my contact information into the chat in the GoToWebinar here. In fact, let me pull the chat up just so. There it is. I'll put my email address in the chat now for you all. Adam@totem.tech, and I'm chatting to everyone. No, I want to chat to everyone. Gary, it looks like I don't have the permission actually to chat to everyone. So if you wouldn't mind sharing double sharing the links to all the participants as well. All right. All right, so we cannot talk about the cybersecurity requirements and how the DoD is going to hold us accountable for protecting the information, for implementing those cybersecurity requirements, unless we know something about the information that it is that we're required to protect. So we're going to start with that. And I have this sort of Russian nesting doll Venn diagram here that displays relationships between several different types of information that we are mandated to protect by virtue of being a government contractor or planning to provide goods or services to the government, and then especially by virtue of being a contractor in the Department of Defense. So overall, all federal government contractors, whether they're a prime contractor getting paid directly from the government agency or a subcontractor, supplier, or a vendor, if we work as part of a supply chain for the federal government, we come into contact with something called Federal Contract Information, FCI. FCI, the definition, almost literally the definition of FCI is all information related to a government contract except for simple like transactional information like invoicing. So all of the information related to a federal government contract that hasn't been explicitly authorized by the federal government to be released to the public is considered federal contract information, with the one exception of invoices, essentially. So all of your email communications, for instance, when you communicate with your customer about a federal government contract, program, good, service, when you communicate with your customer, that information, the email communications are going to be considered federal contract information. The contract itself, the performance work statement, the statement of work, the delivery order, the purchase order, the task order under a federal government contract, all those are going to be considered federal contract information unless they have been deemed explicitly authorized to be released to the public. This includes if you sell commercial off-the-shelf products, COTS products to the federal government. The information related to the product itself is available to the public because it's available commercially, but the information about how you provide that product to the government is going to be considered federal contract information. And as such, we are mandated to put some basic cybersecurity protections in place to protect this FCI. Those cybersecurity requirements are called out in the FAR. That's the Federal Acquisition Regulation. It's the sort of Bible that the government uses to put together contracts. FAR Clause 52.204.21 has 15 subclauses that extrapolate out into 17 requirements, cybersecurity requirements. And these requirements run between a spectrum. They sort of run the gamut from requiring us to have physical security on our facilities, locks on our doors and windows, surveillance systems, alarms, ensure that we only issue keys or entry badges to authorized personnel, ensure that we have visitors log in and then we escort visitors in our facility where the federal contract information is handled. And I use this word handled. We say information handling, that means storing, processing, or transmitting information. So when I use that word handle, that's what I'm talking about. So we have these physical, on one end of the spectrum, these physical security requirements. On the other end of the spectrum, we have logical or digital data security requirements. Things like we must have antivirus installed at appropriate locations, like on a laptop or on a cell phone that handles the federal contract information. And the antivirus must actually be working. It must be kept updated and actually must do scans of files as they're accessed. And then that's the sort of two ends of the spectrum of the 15 subclauses in the FAR, and then there's several other requirements in between, including things like requiring usernames and passwords to log into IT systems. So there's these 15 things that we have to do. All federal government contractors, and there's millions of businesses, mostly small businesses in the federal government supply chain. We all have to put in these basic protections called out by the FAR clause. When we're in the Department of Defense space, eventually we will be subject to being held accountable for putting these cybersecurity protections in place. Right now, it's basically on the honors system. By virtue of signing a contract or agreeing to provide a good or service, we have we as the small business have essentially attested that we have these protections in place. But the DoD needs a higher level of assurance that we are doing what we say we're doing, that we're meeting our obligations. And so under the CMMC, those of us that only handle the federal contract information will be subject to CMMC level 1. On the next slide, we'll show you the structure of the CMMC. That's the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. It's a stratified model. There's 3 layers. We'll explore what those layers mean in a bit. But for now, you need to understand that CMMC level 1 is that level for all federal government contractors. Everyone in any supply chain for the federal government will have to meet at least these obligations. There is a more sensitive subset of federal contract information that requires some additional cybersecurity safeguarding because it's of a more sensitive nature. And there are lots of different categories of this more sensitive information, but in general, the federal government calls this controlled unclassified information, the subset of FCI that's a little bit more sensitive that requires additional protections. And those of you that have been around for a while, you may have heard the phrase in the past, and I'm talking about 10, 15 years ago, sensitive but unclassified information. In some cases, this sensitive information is conflated with a designation called for official use only, FOUO. There's not 100% overlap, but in a lot of cases it's conflated. These are the terms that have been thrown around in the past for this unclassified information. There, in 2010, under the Obama administration, there was an executive order issued that directed a more formal approach to controlled unclassified information. And this executive order directed the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, to perform oversight for categorizing and developing an overarching cybersecurity policy for controlled unclassified information. And so you could encounter CUI under any federal government program. But when we encounter it under a Department of Defense or as part of the Department of Defense supply chain, the DoD complicates matters a little bit more and calls its CUI covered defense information, or CDI. So you may see this acronym thrown around a lot as well. I tend to just say it's just CUI under the auspices of the DoD, the Department of Defense, but you might see CDI as an acronym as well. Most of the CDI, the CUI related to DoD work, is of a technical nature. It's specifications for a part that might go into a DoD weapons system, or testing tolerances for Department of Defense facilities control systems. Technical information related to a Department of Defense program. Technical, or in the case of what we call OPSEC, information about the Department of Defense's mission. And in general, most of us in the DoD supply chain would encounter one of 6 categories of CUI working on a Department of Defense program. And the acronyms here: controlled technical information. So this is information related to primarily to IT or components that go into Department of Defense weapons systems or other types of IT systems. There's DCRIT, which is information about the infrastructure for the DoD itself, including facilities related information, but also information about how the DoD gets internet service, or how it had on bases like water is filtered and provided, how electricity is generated and transmitted on DoD bases. That's critical infrastructure. There's 2 categories that are related to nuclear information, a sort of general catch-all for nuclear related information that's not classified, that's not secret or top secret. Then there's information about naval nuclear propulsion. And then we mentioned this operation security, this information about the DoD's mission. And there's also any of us that handle international traffic and arms regulated information, ITAR, or certain types of certain other types of export controlled information. If that's handled in a federal government sense, it's automatically considered CUI, controlled unclassified information, including on a Department of Defense program. So export controlled information, CTI is usually also export controlled. So these are there's sort of some overlap between these categories. Actually, nuclear information and CTI is usually all considered ITAR. At Haight Bain Associates, we handle controlled technical information and operations security information. The Air Force has told us this. They've identified the CUI that we handle on our program. If we handle CUI as part of a Department of Defense, as part of the supply chain for the Department of Defense, we will see, most likely, we will see an additional contract clause, either directly in a contract, copied into a subcontract, or flowed down through the supply chain through reps and certs types of requirements, memos from our customer, delivery orders, purchase orders. We'll see a clause, a DFARS clause, Department of Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement Clause 252-204-7012. This clause directs us to do 2 things. First of all, provide what's called adequate security for the uncontrolled unclassified information, and that means implementing a bunch of additional security controls. So while there are 15 for federal contract information, there are 110 controls or safeguards that we have to put in place for CUI. So an additional 95 controls for CUI. You can see it's an order of magnitude more sensitive than your run-of-the-mill federal contract information. So we have to provide adequate security. We also have to ensure that we have, as an organization, the ability to detect cybersecurity incidents, respond to those incidents, and report those incidents to the Department of Defense directly. So that's what this clause requires of us. It's a lot to do, to be honest. We're not gonna go too far down the rabbit hole of what it means to put the safeguards in place for CUI. We're going to give you a roadmap for how you approach doing that, but I don't want to go down too many technical rabbit holes on what is required of us for adequate security or incident response, but it's quite a bit of work. We'll see on a timeline slide here in a minute just how long it takes most of us to implement all of these requirements. And in the second part to this series, we'll talk about how much it costs and precisely how long it took Haight Bay and Associates to implement all these things. So that part 2 is coming in November. So there's quite a bit of work to do. And the DoD has identified a significant risk in that much of its supply chain is not doing that work. We are not abiding by our contractual mandate to put these safeguards in place to protect CUI. So the DoD is going to hold us accountable for that. And that's really the impetus behind the CMMC, the certification, is really to protect this controlled unclassified information. And those of us that handle CUI, as we'll see on the next slide in just a bit, will either be targeting in a CMMC level 2 or level 3 certification, depending on the type of the category of CUI that we handle. All right, so it's important, just to take a step back, it's important to understand the relationship between these types of information, because the type of information that you either currently handle or expect to handle as part of executing a federal government contract dictates the level of cybersecurity safeguards that you have to implement and the level to which you'll be held accountable for implementing those standards. The National Archives, by the way, I mentioned under this executive order, they were directed to spin up the CUI management program for the federal government. They maintain a list of the categories of CUI. So if you're interested in exploring examples of what constitutes CUI, and really specific examples of what constitutes things like controlled technical information on the DoD program, you can go to this archives site and explore these lists. Okay, next slide here. So this graphic depicts the layered, the stratified nature of the CMMC. To sort of reiterate here, the CMMC will be the Department of Defense's method for holding us, its supply chain, accountable for implementing the cybersecurity safeguards required to protect certain types of information. CMMC is not a firm and fast requirement yet, and it won't be for probably a year. We'll discuss this in the next slide. But it is coming, and it takes that long to get ready, to prepare, to implement all these safeguards, especially at level 2 and level 3. So just because I'm saying CMMC is not a thing yet is not me telling you to drag your feet or hold off on preparing for it. There's a lot of work to be done. The CMMC will only exist for the time being. When it's a full rule, it will only exist with the Department of Defense. The DoD is, as we like to say, the tip of the spear implementing these supply chain risk management and accountability methods. Other federal agencies will pick up similar types of risk management, supply chain risk management methods. Homeland Security is already talking about it. We'll see Department of Energy have something similar. Department of Education. Health and Human Services has the HIPAA rule in that HIPAA environment, but I think we'll see in years to come that Health and Human Services will also adopt something like CMMC. Excuse me. Okay, but for now, it's only a DoD thing, CMMC. DoD, by its own estimates there are 220,000 members of the defense industrial base. About 64% of the supply chain only handles federal contract information, and therefore only needs to implement the 15 cybersecurity requirements to protect FCI. I emphasize only. This is no cakewalk either, these 15 requirements. I mentioned a spectrum of physical security controls on one end to logical or data security controls on the other end. There are some challenging things in between. Like, most of us have usernames and passwords on IT systems and antivirus and locks on our doors and windows. But there are requirements for some additional technology, like vulnerability scanners, looking for weaknesses in your endpoints, like your laptops and your mobile phones. You actually have to actively go out and try to discover weaknesses in your environment. That's challenging, and it involves some technology that most small businesses don't have in place by default. So this is no cakewalk either, and our CMMC compliance roadmap that we'll start exploring here in a few minutes gives you some pointers on how you can approach implementing these requirements. But good news at level 1, the DoD is only going to require us to do some sort of annual self-assessment and report the results of that assessment to them, to the DoD. The methodology for this assessment has not been published yet, so we don't really know much about how the DoD is going to expect us to do this or report the results. But the DoD has established that at this level, they're only going to be looking for us to do a self-assessment and report the results. So this is for FCI only. Those of us that handle that more sensitive subset of FCI that we call CUI, Controlled Unclassified Information, will be subject to at least CMMC level 2. And we mentioned, or I started to mention, that there's a significant increase in the number of cybersecurity safeguards that we have to put in place, 110 in fact. These safeguards are called out, are published by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology in their special publication 800-171. So those of you that are familiar with CMMC, you'll hear NIST 800-171 or NIST 171. You'll hear that term a lot. The DoD has identified NIST as the publisher of the standard that the DoD wants implemented to protect CUI. And in fact, that standard is required no matter what federal agency you're in. There's a law essentially that requires 800-171 for the protection of CUI. So order of magnitude increase in the number of controls. As we'll see in the next part of this webinar series, there's also an order of magnitude in cost and timeline that it takes to implement all these safeguards, these controls. And at this level, the government wants a higher level of assurance that we have done our job implementing the safeguards. And so instead of just an annual self-assessment or self-affirmation, which will be required every year, we're also going to have to go hire a third-party assessment organization, an independent, objective company, to perform a full scope assessment on the implementation of all these controls. This is not going to be inexpensive. All right, this is going to be costly to hire this third party. The Department of Defense is in the process, simultaneously with publishing the rules, so working out the regulation that dictates this CMMC paradigm. They are, in parallel to that, building up an ecosystem of the third-party assessment organizations and these independent assessors that will be employed by those organizations. It's all going to be private sector, so these are not government entities that are that are going to be doing these assessments at level 2. So there's a whole industry, an ecosystem that needs to be built up, and it's going to take the DoD a while to do that. If you handle what we call CUI plus, which is an even more sensitive subset of CUI, dealing with mostly with high value or high risk DoD weapons systems. So information related to like hypersonic missiles, which is the new arms race that we find ourselves in with our adversaries. Information related to our nuclear arsenal upgrade. So if you weren't aware, we're upgrading most of our ballistic missile fleet, our nuclear arsenal. So information related to those upgrades. Information related to missile defense. So on the other end, being able to shoot down ballistic missiles and hypersonics. If you work on or anticipate working on in the supply chain for those types of programs, you're going to be handling more sensitive CUI. And when you handle that at that level, or that type of information is going to dictate that you're going to be approaching CMMC at level 3. Okay. And by the way, level 2, DoD estimates about 36% of the industrial base handles CUI, about 80,000 of us. And so if you think about every 3 years, you're going to have to get one of these independent assessments done. It's triennial. That means there are, by DoD's estimates, 26,667 of these assessments that have to happen every year, and certifications issued every year. Almost 27,000, right? So it's quite a bit of work to be done by the ecosystem that's being built up. At level 3, though, the DoD estimates only a fraction of the supply chain will be handling that sensitive information. About fewer than 1,000 of us. So it'll be all the large prime contractors will handle that, your Northrop Grummons, your Boeings, your Raytheons, your BAEs. They'll certainly be in this context, but we actually have clients at Totem that do things like manufacture components for hypersonic missiles, but they're small businesses. They will be, we've encouraged them to anticipate being slotted into level 3 as well when CMMC is fully on board, fully published. At this level, you will have an additional set of cybersecurity safeguards to implement. We're not quite sure exactly how many safeguards there will be. The DoD's hinted at that there'll be an additional 24, but this is yet to be determined. Either way, when it is finally determined, the additional safeguards will be published in another NIST document, the 800-172, which is a document called the Enhanced Protection of CUI. And at this level, in addition to every 3 years being required to get that third-party independent objective assessment, you'll also be assessed by the government for the delta. The additional controls will be assessed by the government. There is an office that the government currently maintains, the DoD currently maintains under the Defense Contractor Management Agency, an office called the DIBCAC, DIBCAC, Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center. DIBCAC is currently conducting assessments at what would be equivalent to level 2. DIBCAC will then, once CMMC has been published and the ecosystem has been fully developed, they will also transition to do these level 3 assessments as well. Okay, so just to recap, CMMC is a 3-layer model where it's a certification, an assessment and certification regime. The result of being required to being part of the CMMC process will be that you are issued a certification, whether it's from the DoD itself as a result of a self-assessment at level 1, or the certification being issued by a certified third-party assessment organization, or then by the government on top at level 2 or level 3. That really depends on what type of information that your organization handles. FCI only at level 1, CUI, let's just say CUI medium level at level 2 and CUI high level at level 3. Okay, so this is the CMMC model. This presentation is going to be showing you a roadmap for when CMMC is coming, and then we're going to transition into some milestones and goals that you can set as an organization to prepare for the CMMC. But I do want to encourage you to start preparing, even if you don't yet have a government contract. You need to start thinking about putting the cybersecurity protections in place, or at a minimum, understanding the types of information that you anticipate handling. But you want to start as soon as possible putting the cybersecurity protections in place, because it can take a while. So what we see here is a timeline for CMMC. We are here. Oh, I can't believe it's it's mid-September. I can't believe that. This year has flown by. The Department of Defense has put a line in the sand of October 2025, by which they want all new contracts to include the CMMC provision. So all new contracts by that point will include the requirement to go have some sort of CMMC certification, depending on the type of information that you handle. So that's the line in the sand. I mentioned that the DoD is in the process of what's called rulemaking, publishing the CMMC rule so that it can be, so that the DoD has it available to put in contracts and flow down through contracts. There's a rulemaking, regulation making process that federal agencies have to go through to be able to demand things of their supply chain. At the latest, in October sometime, the rule will be published. So it will be published to the public, and we will have an opportunity to comment on it, to complain, to suggest changes. Like we have the opportunity to do that. The rule will be published in the Federal Register. Depending on the format that it's published in, we'll either have a period of 60 days for public comment, after which the clause would be available for the DoD to start injecting in new contracts. Or more likely, the rule will be published in a format that allows for a longer period of public comment, where the DoD has to address each and every one of our comments. And there will be hundreds of comments on CMMC, because it has significant ramifications for the supply chain, costs, and resource burden for small businesses especially. So much more likely it'll be maybe even over a year before all of those comments, those public comments, have been adjudicated, and the DoD then has the option to put the CMMC requirement in contracts. To be honest, the DoD needs the year. The ecosystem that it's building up of the assessment ecosystem is not adequate yet to be performing tens of thousands of assessments on an annual basis. There are not enough assessors. There are not enough companies out there that could do those third-party assessments. So the DoD needs this time. So most likely it won't be until late 2024, early 25 before CMMC requirement will start showing up in contracts. DoD has stated that they will not be modifying existing contracts. They will only be adding clauses into new contracts going forward. So there'll be some sort of like phase-in period. Some phase-in is the appropriate word there. In the meantime, NIST is slated to revise the 800.171 standard that those of us at CMMC level 2 will face, and it's looking like there'll be a significant increase in the number of safeguards. So if you recall, there are 110 safeguards right now. It's looking like there'll be an additional 30% or so additional burden in the next revision 3 of this 800.171 standard. So we can, those of us in the supply chain, in addition to being subject to being held accountable for implementing the standard, we're going to face a sort of new, improved, larger scope standard. And if you're targeting level 3, if you're working on those very sensitive DoD weapons system programs, we anticipate the formal publication of the 172 standard sometime later next year, maybe this time next year. So I'm talking about next year, maybe even 2025. It would seem that you can drag your feet maybe, or maybe even stick your head in the sand and just forget about this for a little while. But you really can't. This blue bar here is a graphical representation of how long it takes our average client, including ourselves, to implement the 800.171 standard. It's well over a year. Most of us are looking at a year and a half or more to implement the standard. There are a lot of things to do. The 110 controls, there's a lot of stuff to do. Everywhere runs the spectrum again from physical to security to logical, digital security. There's a lot of stuff to be done in there, including spinning up a training program, doing periodic risk assessments, cyber risk assessments, which no small business that we encounter has ever done one of those. And so you need coaching and help on how to do that. I mentioned training. You have to have a whole continuous monitoring capability. So most of us actually have to outsource part of these safeguards to managed service providers that sort of monitor our IT environment for adversarial activities, monitor the environment for hacker infiltration or data exfiltration via ransomware or organized crime. Like, we got to actively monitor and maintain our environment. So there's a lot to be done. And most of us aren't made of money, so we can't just throw money at the problem. We have to implement things piecemeal over time. That was true for Hate Bay. It has been true for Hate Bay. We're still on our journey. We're not quite 100% yet. And really never will be, because the standard's constantly changing. So if you back out from October 2025, let's say you don't see the clause in your contract until then, that's the requirement for CMMC, the latest you could drag your feet is sometime mid part of next year. But I would stress, you do not want to drag your feet if you anticipate at all that you are going to handle CUI on your contract, or if you already have the DFARS 7012 clause in your contract or flowed down to you through the subcontract chain. It takes several weeks just to build the plans, the documentation that dictates how you're going to implement all these safeguards. And as I mentioned, it can take a year plus to actually implement all these safeguards. Most small businesses do not by default have the level of stringent cybersecurity safeguards in place as they have been normally operating for however long they've been operating. This is really foreign territory to many of our clients and many small businesses. It's not to say that it can't be explored. It's not to say that small businesses can't be taught to understand and be taught to help implement what's required. It's definitely doable. It just takes a long time. The analogy that I like to make is CMMC conformance is a journey. And it's not like we're journeying to Mount Everest. It's not like, for most of us, Mount Everest is an impossible task. You have to be in great physical shape, have a ton of money and free time to be able to get over there and do all the base camping and acclimating that's required to climb Mount Everest. Most of us are not going to be able to do that in our lifetimes. But most of us could hike the Appalachian Trail or hike the Pacific Coast Trail. It's going to take us a while, but we could do it, most of us. And I liken CMMC conformance to hiking the Appalachian Trail. It's going to take us a while, but we can do it. Totem Tech, our whole mission is to act as a sort of trail guide and help you along in that journey. We have a ton of free resources for you, some of which we will take a look at today. So I'm going to pause just for a second and take a sip of water. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I want to go through our roadmap to CMMC compliance. The correct word is conformance, but compliance is fine. So what we have on this graphic are a series of milestones and goals in order, so in sequenced order, that small businesses can use to approach, first of all, being ready to participate now in the defense industrial base, and then also prepare to pass a CMMC assessment when CMMC is a thing, and then also to to maintain a compliant system. This is not fire and forget. It's not one and done. Like, this is going to be a never ending, as long as you participate in the DIB, in the defense industrial base, it'll be a never ending series of what we call care and feeding of a cybersecurity program. All right, so I'm gonna actually escape out of this slideshow for just a sec. This is an interactive slideshow, so I can actually click on these things and dive into them, but I want to show you where you can download your own version of this compliance roadmap and explore it actually interactively on our website. So I'm going to go to our website. I'm going to put a link to this in the chat, and let's see, I don't think I have the ability yet to chat with everyone. No, so I'm going to put this in the chat, Gary, if you don't mind chatting that out to everyone. I would appreciate it. This is our interactive CMMC compliance roadmap on our website, totem.tech. And if you hover over any of these milestones, you can get links to free tools that we have available for our small business peers. Most of these are blogs and templates of documents that we use as part of our own compliance. And then we also have paid for services. I'm not going to make this into a sales call, but if any of you want additional one-on-one help or want to be part of a cohort of like-minded companies, like going through our preparation workshop, we host workshops on a periodic basis as well. We'd love to have you with us. But for now, know that we had a slew of free tools for you to explore and get familiar with. So anyway, what I'm about to show you in a PowerPoint presentation is available on this website as well. And you can download it, a PowerPoint version of this from the website. Well, let's go back into the presentation. All right, our compliance roadmap has 3 phases, starting with self-assessment and planning. So understanding what you're facing and planning your journey, your Appalachian Trail hike. And then starting the hike, all right, implementing all the requirements, preparation for the actual certification when the DoD has the ecosystem ready. And then after that, as I mentioned, your job is not done. You have to maintain, you have to provide care and feeding for your cybersecurity program. So let's dig into, and by the way, we would say your cybersecurity maturity increases as you go along this pathway, this roadway. So let's talk about the very first step. Before you all buy technology or put new procedures in place or really even purchase any kind of consulting or managed services, you want to understand the scope. You want to identify what FCI or CUI or CUI for many of us might exist or currently exists in your environment and characterize its life cycle in your environment. We have several free tools, and I mentioned the NARA website, and there's a link that on the slide to the NARA CUI website that will help you do the identification of the information that you might handle. Bearing in mind, FCI is all information related to a federal government contract. So that's kind of a no-brainer. If you work in a federal government supply chain, you have to put those 15 requirements in. But CUI, we want to identify the specific elements and trace those elements' life cycle throughout our environment. How do we receive it or generate it? How do we handle it? How do we store it? How do we mark it? There are actually marking and handling instructions for CUI dictated by the Department of Defense. Do we have to transmit it anywhere? To who? When? Why? And then at the end, when we're finished either executing the contract or the information is obsolete or moot, we need to dispose of it securely. So there's 6 phases to information lifecycle: receipt generation, handling, storage, marking, transmission, disposal. We want to do a sort of who, what, when, where, how, and why activity with each of those phases to determine how the CUI matriculates in our environment. The result of that exercise will be a list of what we call assets. Hardware, software, networking, the information itself, the people that handle the information using hardware and software and networking devices. Any asset, well, I left one out, the facilities, your buildings are considered assets as well. Any asset that facilitates any phase of the life cycle is what we call in scope. You have to put some sort of security measures in place to protect those assets. I say some sort of because it really depends on what the asset is to dictate what exactly the cybersecurity safeguards are that you have to put in place. Like, you're not going to put antivirus on your building. You put that on a workstation. All right. So, but you understand the result of the scoping exercise that the organization has an understanding and can catalog the list of assets that support any of those life cycle phases. That's the second step in our roadmap. Gather the stakeholders and do the life cycle determination, the life cycle characterization exercise, and then literally start listing your assets. It can be in a spreadsheet. There are tools available that help you list assets. Totem provides such a tool, but you can start jotting it down in a notepad. Write it down in a notepad. Just start generating the list, okay? Then you can start developing the plans on how you are going to implement the required safeguards to protect those assets. And it all starts with a system security plan. That's like a set of blueprints, SSP. It's like a set of blueprints that dictates expected outcome from a cybersecurity program. We mentioned that you also need an incident response plan that dictates how your organization is going to respond to the inevitable attack. And those attacks can be from the outside in or from the inside out. Insider threats, whether it's intentional or not, is a very serious and prevalent form of cybersecurity incident. Your plans probably will not be fully in place. Your blueprints, in other words, will not have been fully translated into a tangible living and breathing cybersecurity program yet. So you'll need something that's called a plan of action and milestones, POAM. This is like the get well plan. This is the gap remediation plan, the fixing of the deficiencies in your cybersecurity program. You know what the requirements are, the list of safeguards and controls. They're published by the NIST and the federal government. You probably don't have them all in place, so you need a plan of how you get them all in place. These milestones, by the way, you're going to execute whether you are CMMC level 1, 2, or 3. It's going to be exceedingly difficult even to maintain a CMMC level 1 cybersecurity program for the protection of FCI without some sort of documentation on how you're going to do it. Even though there's only 15 things, it's still challenging. If you handle CUI, you want to test your incident response and reporting capability. You're in fact required to do this by the DFARS 7012. And to report incidents to the DoD, you actually need a set of credentials. It's called a External Certification Authority, ECA certificate. We have a blog on how to obtain that certificate. You actually have to authorize yourself. You have to prove your identity, your organization's identity to the DoD to report an incident. And so we have incident response plan template. We have how to obtain the ECA certificate. We also can help run through exercising of incident response and reporting if you'd like some outside help with this. Then you'll need to self-assess. Whether you're at level 1, level 2, or level 3, you need to do a self-assessment. If you're at level 2, if you have DFARS 7012 in your contract or flow down to you in a subcontract vehicle, you're actually required to report the results of your self-assessment, something called an SPRS score, SPRS score, to the Department of Defense. And we have a blog on how to report your SPRS score. That's this one right here. When you're ready to do that. We also have a workshop that that's an hour-and-a-half long workshop that we take folks through on how to generate an SPRS score and report it if you're facing that requirement. This is not, the SPRS score is not a requirement at CMMC level 1 for FCI. Only those of us that handle CUI right now. So in terms of level 1, you'll be doing scoping, cataloging, developing your plans, and self-assessment. Okay. At level 2 or level 3, you also need to do an incident response and reporting test. But at that point, once you have your plans in place and you know and you've started implementing and shoring up your gaps, you're ready to participate in the defense industrial base. You're cybersecurity ready. You're DIB ready. All right. So the good news now is you don't have to be fully have 800-171 fully implemented to be able to participate in the DIB. You have to be working towards it. If you only handle FCI, though, you do need all those 15 things in place to be able to participate in supply chain. We've actually had clients, had their customers tell them, we are not going to send you any more work until you can affirm that you have the basic level protections for FCI in place. And that affirmation comes through filling out questionnaires or answering an email or a memo. Then after this comes the more challenging work, the steeper climbs on the Appalachian Trail. You actually have to implement all of the cybersecurity safeguards. And right now we're talking about for CUI level 2 because it's assumed you've already implemented the 15 basic safeguards just by virtue of working in the federal government. You need to execute your POAM. You need to fix deficient capabilities. Most of us are going to outsource some of these capabilities to what's called a managed service provider or a managed security service provider. Haight Bain Associates does that. We outsource our continuous monitoring, so the hunting for bad guy activity, we outsource to a managed security service provider. We don't have the time nor the resources to do it internally, and it's more efficient to outsource it. It's not cheap, but it's more efficient than us trying to do it internally. So we can help introduce you to trusted partners. We also offer a managed service and an enclave for CUI, cloud-based, what we call enclave or isolated CUI environment, or we can introduce you to partners. Your Apex Accelerator counselors may be able to do this as well. We can also help you develop some strategies for how to approach MSSPs. Part of the requirement at CMMC level 2 for the protection of CUI is to have a awareness and training program for your staff. So you want to make sure that you have rules of behavior established, an acceptable use policy, an employee handbook, something like that, and train your staff on their responsibilities. All right, we have lots of resources for you for this, like an acceptable use policy, aka rules of behavior template, and we can actually help perform the training as well. There are also lots of free cybersecurity training resources out there. Then once CMMC ecosystem is up and running, and like you could conceivably go pull the trigger on paying an independent third party for that certification, you do want to do a readiness review. You want an independent third party set of eyes to do a once over of your cybersecurity program and ensure that you're not going to waste your money hiring this third-party assessment organization. The assessment is thumbs up or thumbs down. You either are just about perfect in terms of implementation of the 800-171 standard, or you're not, and you don't get a certificate, and you don't get to participate in the DIB. So it's going to be a good idea to have a readiness review. And at that point, you could then go purchase the services of what's called a C3PAO, CMMC Third Party Assessment Organization. Again, There are some of these companies currently in the ecosystem, but there are not enough right now to support CMMC at any kind of steady state. You can actually hire the services of these C3PAOs right now and go through something called a joint surveillance voluntary assessment, which most likely would translate into an eventual CMMC certification down the road, but that all hasn't been solidified as policy by the DoD. So it's going to be a little while before most of us are, first of all, ready, and then second of all, willing to go hire these C3PAOs. But we do. Totem Tech is not one. You can't both consult and C3PAO assess a company, so we want to stay on the consulting side. But we do have C3PAO partners. Your Apex Accelerator counselors will get much more familiar with C3PAOs as well as time goes on. Then let's say everything goes well, you get your CMMC certification at level 2, or the DoD has agreed that your self-assessment is adequate at level 1. You're off and rolling. You're doing work, but your cybersecurity awareness can't stop there. You're going to have to be able to demonstrate that you, like I keep using this term, you feed and care for your cybersecurity program, that you monitor and maintain it. Technology will change, personnel will change, the statutes, regulations, and standards will change. You're going to have to be paying attention to all of this. So there are sort of 3 aspects to this phase. You're going to monitor your program, periodically executing routine maintenance tasks, self-assessing at least annually. That's going to be a requirement for CMMC, and reporting the results. We have something called continuous monitoring plan template that lists out all of the conceivable periodic activities that will have to happen after certification. We also built our company around something we call the Totem tool, which is a cybersecurity program and planning and maintenance tool. That's what we use to perform the routine maintenance on our cybersecurity program. At level 2, CMMC level 2 for CUI, you're going to have to do an annual risk assessment, at least annually. Cyber risk assessment is not something most small businesses have done. It's not a matter of just like doing a vulnerability scan of your program or running some tool against your firewall. It's a more in-depth process. We can help with risk assessments. We also have published our methodology, our small business risk assessment approach, for review and download in a blog, so you can get to that. And by the way, I'm going to make all these slides available through the TGI Apex Accelerator. As I mentioned, you can also download these from our website directly. And then what it all boils down to, cybersecurity is risk management through configuration management. Your environment is constantly changing. The IT environment is constantly changing. We have to be able to securely adapt to those changes. Really, ultimately, what we're trying to prove to an assessor is that we can maintain resilience. We can change securely through a changing environment. And so we'll have to have configuration management plans, secure process guides, and then we'll have to keep up to date with intelligence on threats that those of us in our industry and those of us our business size are facing. So we have our monthly town halls the last Thursday of every month. They're free to attend, 6 p.m. Eastern. You can sign up on our town halls page. We also have our knowledge base, which is a free posting. We post weekly, if not daily, on relevant topics related to federal government contractor cybersecurity. So lots of ways that we provide intelligence and threat intelligence, but there are lots of sources of information out there, including your Apex Accelerator counselors. Yeah, so that is the roadmap. So to reiterate, the first step on your journey should not be to go buy some technology to solve all of your cybersecurity problems. First of all, that technology does not exist. Anybody that's trying to sell you an appliance or some software that you can put in your environment that magically fixes your cybersecurity problems, they're selling you snake oil. It doesn't exist. Only about 50% of your problem is technology related. The other 50% is policies, people, and procedures related. All right. If you're only going to handle FCI, you're going to be doing a few things in the first self-assessment and plan aspect, and also be able to maintain your IT system's health through a changing environment. If you are going to handle CUI, CMMC level 2 or above, you're going to be doing all of these things on the roadmap. All right. I know it's a mouthful. I know it's a fire hose of information. You may not have even gotten past the delineation of the various types of information. I know it's a lot. Most of us need multiple exposures to all this for it to start sinking in. But we have lots of resources for you. I would encourage you to visit our website and download or explore the interactive roadmap. And then I would also encourage you to join us in November for the second part of this series, where we'll talk about how much it costs and how long it takes to do all this stuff. I'm happy to stick around for as long as there are questions, but that is what I had to present. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Adam, for delivering an excellent presentation today. You provided us with a lot of really good information that we certainly need to be aware of. We have a few questions. Since CMMC 2.0 isn't officially a mandate yet, what can small businesses do now to start being prepared for CMMC 2.0 when it arrives?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That's what we've tried to lay out with this roadmap, and also with just sort of scratching the surface with how long it's going to take. Okay. So when we talk about actually getting the CMMC certification, we're down here in this roadmap, 2/3 of the way down. You have to do all of this stuff to prepare for CMMC certification. And like I said, don't go buy the tech right away. Gain an understanding of the FCI and CUI in your environment, or that you might expect to handle in the future. That's the first step, scoping. So these first couple steps are actually, they can be done just by gathering your stakeholders, and they don't require any technology. Listing all the assets. Even if you did nothing else, like let's say your company was like, yeah, the federal government contracting in cybersecurity is just going to be too much for us. If your business is still going to operate in today's environment, you're still under constant cybersecurity threat. And if you do nothing else but find yourself in the unfortunate position one day down the road of having been attacked, God forbid you get ransomware and all your systems are locked up, and you're going to have to call for help, who are you going to call, right? The Ghostbusters? No, you're going to be in a panic trying to find a company like Totem Tech to help. The first thing we're going to ask you for is, do you have a list of all of the assets? In other words, do you know what could possibly be on fire so that we can help you start putting the fire out? So you got to do this stuff anyway, and it's not that challenging. The plans, there's template for plans. It's a lot of writing, to be honest, at CMMC level 2 for CUI, but there's templates out there, there's plans. So that's what you want to start getting to work on. If you want the single most effective thing that you can do in your environment, and that is to train your staff. That is to develop an acceptable use policy, aka rules of behavior, and train your staff on the expectations. The most effective technology out there is multi-factor authentication, required at CMMC level 2 for CUI. For most of us, we don't have multi-factor authentication across the board, so it would be part of executing a POAM, putting MFA in wherever it can be implemented. That's where I would start.
Okay, perfect. If your contract contains the DFARS 7012 clause, doesn't that require you to have a self-assessment score in SPURS?
No, The 7012 clause does not. There are two associated clauses, the 252-204-7019 and 7020. Those are the clauses that require the SPURS score. And you may not even see those clauses. We've had clients that have their prime customer, like let's say Northrop Grumman, sends out a memo saying we need you to have your SPURS score in before we can send you any work. They might not even quote the specific clause 7019 and 7020, but it's not the 7012. The 7012 clause does not require the SPURS score. It's an associated clause 7019, 7020. We have the, by the way, we have a SPURS workshop, as I mentioned, scoring workshop, hour and a half long. We run soup to nuts, everything you need to know about SPURS scoring, if any of you are interested.
Okay, perfect. What are your thoughts on encrypted enclaves, sub-environments to store or transfer CUI or CDI?
Yep, so great question, and my thoughts are thumbs up if you can do that, if you're in the enviable position of being able to say, we don't handle that much CUI, or we don't handle it frequently, or it's not all pervasive and for our company. So we can take that CUI and we're going to isolate it to a single laptop, or we're going to isolate it to a cloud environment like Microsoft 365, and the rest, it's never going to touch the rest of our IT system, never going to touch the rest of our corporate environment. If you are in the enviable position of being able to make a determination like that and build what we call an enclave, then I say go for it. It can save you a lot of time, money, and heartache. Many of us, though, are not in that position. Hate Bay and Associates is a great example. Everything, the whole reason for being for Hate Bay and Associates is to execute an Air Force contract. The entirety of our operations is pregnant with CUI. That's a more positive word than contaminated, but like you could think of it either way. Like CUI is pervasive in our environment. We don't have the option to build an enclave. Many of our manufacturing clients also do not have that option because they'll have CUI in digital format, like they'll receive a spec from a customer for a part that they're going to build. But then, and from that spec, they design drawings and then have to print those drawings out so that the line workers, the operators, can actually go build the part. And so they have a spectrum of information media to like cloud-based reception of information from the customer, digital-based design on workstations, printed material. It's challenging to try to conceive an enclave, an isolated environment for the CUI in that environment. But on the other hand, we have many clients, especially those just starting their journey, that don't handle a lot of CUI. And they just say, all right, we're going to dedicate one workstation, one router, one person to handle all the CUI. And that's the notion of an enclave, and it's very advantageous.
Okay, great. If you aren't ready for CMMC 2.0 when it arrives, and you become ready shortly after it's here, and there's going to be a long line, how long do you think it's going to take for the assessors to be ready to assess your company?
That is a great question. If CMMC 2.0 was a thing tomorrow, the line would be like the line to greet Mickey Mouse at Disney World, like real long, like a line you don't want to stand in. There are 48 C3PAOs last time I checked last week, and only 150 or so authorized assessors. You'll need between 200 and 300 companies and between 2,000 and 3,000 assessors to make CMMC approach some sort of steady state. So the line is going to be exceedingly long. It's a serious challenge for the DoD and the accreditation body to figure out how to prioritize companies that get access to the C3PAOs. I don't have a good answer for it. I can only assume that smarter folks than me are working on that problem. There's an additional problem to this, and it's looking more and more like our managed service providers, our MSPs. because they have administrative access into our environment, the DoD, it looks like they're going to require that our MSPs also get certified. And so when you look at numbers like 80,000 at level 2, I think that number maybe doubles when you include MSPs having to get certified at this level. So a serious challenge. We'll talk more about this in the second part of this series, costs and duration. We can even do a deep dive into the napkin math, by which I come up with that number of between 2,000 to 3,000 assessors in that session. But I don't really have a good answer for how long that line is going to be and how the DoD determines who gets priority access to these C3POs, and what happens if you don't get access but the contract's been awarded and ready to start. It's not clear.
Okay, perfect. Are SPUR scores subject to the False Claims Act?
Great question. I would assume so. So if you report a false score or are grossly inaccurate in your score, I would assume you could be held liable under the False Claims Act, but I don't know that for sure, and I'm not a lawyer.
Okay.
So our suggestion is to report as accurate a score as you possibly can at the time of required reporting, and reassess periodically. You're required to reassess at least every 3 years, but most of us are going to be in a much more dynamic change environment than that we should be assessing much more frequently than that, at least annually.
Okay. Will all 3 CMMC 2.0 levels need to be verified by a government assessor?
No. Nope. Only level 3 when CMMC is a real thing. Okay, so level 1, self-assessment only. Level 2, you get issued a certification by a third-party assessment organization. Level 3 is where the government comes in and does the delta assessment on the additional however many controls will be at this level. We're not sure yet. So it's only level 3. At some point though, a government person will be putting eyes on all of this. Like a government contracting officer is going to look to check that you have a certification at level 2, but they're not doing the assessment.
Okay. You mentioned that there's unfortunately some bad actors out there that can, try to sell a small business technology or, equipment that they don't need. How can small businesses prevent from being sold such things?
First of all, understand that there is no single technology that solves all of your problems. There's not the magic bullet. It just doesn't exist. And then second, when the business is developing their plans, take your time developing, especially your system security plan. In the process of developing that system security plan, you will become familiar with these requirements. Most likely, you're going to need some consultation to help interpret these requirements, whether that's Totem or one of our peers or Apex accelerators, or there's a thing called Project Spectrum out there, which is not exactly sufficient right now, but it's maturing. It's a government-led initiative to provide more information, more interpretation on these requirements. You'll most likely need some consultation. Even if you don't, you're going to want to take your time and look through the controls and get all of the supplemental guidance that's out there. NIST puts out a ton, the DoD puts out a ton, and then you'll understand which controls require technology and which don't, and then you'll be able to hone in on which technologies or software that you might need. But I would really suggest, if you're worried about making a mistake with technology and what to buy to put in place, then consult with an expert.
Okay. When searching for MSP and security assessors for help in achieving compliance for CMMC 2.0, what are the key characteristics? Lots of firms saying they're experts, but finding that that isn't the reality.
Oh, yes. Well, this is the challenge. There are a lot of fly-by-night companies that have been spun up lately to take advantage of the ecosystem. All right. So what I would look for is letters of reference from other small businesses or sort of government partners. Like we can produce letters of reference from Apex accelerators, manufacturing extension partners, and other businesses that we've helped. So I would look for that. I would ask them some specific questions. Like I would ask them to explain to you this model, the CMMC model, and explain to you, here's a question that you can ask a prospective consultant. What is the assessment methodology for 800-171? And from where do you draw your assessment objectives? Okay, I'll state that again because it's a question that will cut to the core and be able to help you understand and I'll tell you what the correct answer is. Where does the assessment methodology from 800-171 come from? And from where do you draw your assessment objectives? If they can't answer that question, and here's the answer, if they can't answer the question, then I would look elsewhere. The answer is the Department of Defense put together the assessment methodology and directs you to a NIST companion document called the 800-171A, and I'll type that in the chat. And those lists actually 320 assessment objectives. We have found that many of the snake oil salesmen and the inadequate consultants out there don't understand that premise. That yes, there are 110 controls, but there are actually 320 things that we have to grade ourselves on or have an independent assessor grade us. And much of the heartache so clients will come to us having already consulted with someone that doesn't really know what they're talking about, and they only assessed at the high level. They scratched the surface of the assessment, in other words, and they didn't dig into the details, and they didn't adequately prepare them for the forthcoming CMMC assessments. So that's a differentiating question you can ask a prospective. There is also what's called the Cyber AB, which is the accreditation body that has a 501c nonprofit contract with they are a 501c nonprofit. They have a contract with the DoD to build this ecosystem. They are certifying individuals, a certified CMMC practitioner and certified CMMC assessor. Those are halfway decent certifications. All right. Registered practitioners, and admittedly, I am one. You'll see on this CMMC RP. All I had to do was take a quick exam and pay $500, and I'm an RP. So the RP designation is not sufficient in my mind to qualify an individual as a qualified consultant in this field. It's more of a marketing designation. A lot of people want to see it after my name or our team's name, but it wasn't rigorous enough of an exam or a certification process to be worth it. We claim a certain level of credibility through our experience and through our experiences, really. That's a great question, a long-winded one. Gary, do you think I answered that sufficiently, or did I go off?
No, I think you answered it perfectly.
Okay.
And we do have one more question. Are RPOs from the Cyber AB vetted?
To be an RPO, you have to be a US-based company, I believe US-based, and pay $5,000. That's it. And have an RP on staff, I guess. But again, all it takes for an RP is $500 and pass a quick exam. sit through a quick training and pass an exam. So they are vetted. Is that vetting adequate? I'll let you all decide.
Well, Adam, I'm not seeing any more questions, but I do want to thank you for joining us today. You did an excellent job on presenting this very crucial information. And
Well, I
we look
appreciate
forward
that.
to having you again in November. And to everybody else, have a wonderful day. And you can always reach out to us with any additional questions you may have, and we can provide answers for those questions. Thank
Really
you, and we
appreciate the
will see
opportunity.
you
Thanks.
on, yeah, absolutely. We'll see you in November.